As you can see here on the agenda, we still have several presentations and we're really excited for the next one. I'd like to introduce MJ. MJ's presentation is entitled Respecting and Protecting Communities of Color Involved in the Family Regulation System. MJ is the founder of MJ Consulting, a grassroots organization dedicated to dismantling culturally incompetent practices and mitigating such practices' impact on the community by challenging sources of oppression and inequity in the child welfare system. In this session, MJ will explore the colonizing mentality of the family regulation system, including workers' role in identifying their trauma footprints from a culture of individualism. The audience will learn about new ways of respecting collective culture and healing from the trauma of the family regulation system. These are critical conversations, and we're really excited to have MJ join us. MJ will present for about 20 minutes and leave about 10 minutes for the audience's Q&A. Welcome, MJ.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. This is my first time at this conference, and I'm absolutely excited to be here. Just like my intro said, Stacy, we will have a conversation, a very quick conversation of just kind of bringing it all together at the very end. This is more of an introduction. I just want to give a little bit more background. I teach at the University of Denver Graduate School of Social Work. So I do teach social workers. A lot of the classes that I teach are around racism, equity, social justice, power, privilege, and oppression. Also child welfare, student and classes around the child welfare and the abolishment of the child welfare system as well. So essentially, whenever I'm having these conversations, a lot of these conversations are new, especially to people that are still working within the system. I do currently still work within the system. I worked with, in the state of Colorado here in Denver, which is where I'm located, with the Guardian Ad Litem's office, and I currently still hold a caseload. So I am a social worker and also considered a clinical consultant and consult on cases with attorneys that represents children. So I've been doing that for about 10 years now. I then ventured out on supporting parents to help get their kids back whenever they had a dependency and neglect case. And the way that parents were treated made me say, okay, I need to go out on my own because the system is a lot more flawed than I thought it was, because I was just very much in the lane of protecting the children and supporting the children. And that was my lens, essentially. Then I recently, in the state of Colorado, we developed a program. We're going on our year 2 of the parent advocate program. So I currently supervise and mentor parents that have had a dependency and neglect case, DNN cases here in the state of Colorado, and then have successfully gotten their kids back. So what they do is they work as peer advocates for other parents to help them be successful in obtaining their kids from the foster care system. So in doing that, again, seeing a lot of the injustices on the side of how parents are treated, as well as viewing how the foster care system, specifically here in the state of Colorado, is used as a private adoption agency. So I have a few statistics I want to show you about what that looks like. What I currently do now is I'm not working one-on-one with parents anymore, but now I am one of the only experts in the state of Colorado that expert on social science of racism within the child welfare system. So what that looks like is if there is a case where a child may be adopted out by a culture that is not of their own and the parents and or kinship, usually I testify on behalf of kinship. If kinship is a healthy place for that child to be with, and I testify on behalf of kinship for that child to be placed with kinship and not be adopted out from the foster care system. So they bring me in as a cultural expert, as an expert on attachment, cultural attachment, international psychology, and so forth. My education is master's in social work. In my background, I was obtaining my PhD in international psychology. With obtaining my PhD in international psychology, I was in my very last year of my dissertation. And I realized, and I did some work internationally. I worked with the Syrian refugee population transitioning into the German education system. I also worked in the Philippines and in Kuwait as well. So essentially what my job was to do is to understand what is the relationship with that collective culture and psychology. And usually we identify psychology as more of a white man's science, not necessarily because it's only applicable to white people, but it's been utilized to support white theories, and sometimes negate and go against communities of color and collective culture. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So as I was on my way to obtain my PhD, I realized specifically within the child welfare system how psychology has been weaponized against communities of color, against people of color. Examples of that is the misdiagnosis or the overdiagnosis of schizophrenia in Black men and women. I believe Black men were 6 times more likely to be diagnosed with having schizophrenia, even though it was false and they did not have it. Same with having Black women and having the misdiagnosis of schizophrenia. I've also seen the field of psychology being utilized and weaponized against communities of color with the theory of attachment theory. An example of that can say, this young child has been placed in a possible adoptive placement home, and if we move them back to their birth family, then they will not be able to attach again, or they will have reactive attachment, which there's no research to actually prove that and show that, as well as culture was not necessarily implemented in any of those attachment studies. So with that being said, I said, I can't continue my PhD within psychology. I wanted something more of that social justice aspect, which is how I got into my current PhD program, which is leadership development and social justice change, with Fielding Graduate School and Santa Barbara, but it's a hybrid program. So we do research internationally and some research also in California and Canada, and as well as some online hybrid models. So I say that to say, because my entire lens of how I have worked within the child welfare field, which I've been working within the field since 2010, really changed how I currently operate with that social justice lens. I don't know if you can tell, but I come from the idea of abolishing the system. Most people don't have an understanding of what the term abolishment means, as it is in relation to the child welfare system, which we refer to as the family regulation system or the family policing system. Essentially, the way that our organization and my community defines abolishment of the child welfare system is to say the people that are more negatively impacted by the system should be the ones to actually incorporate the system, develop the system of what's best for their families, what's best for their communities. So it's more of this respectful piece. And that comes with the idea of an individualistic versus a collective culture. So individualistic cultures are cultures that are more westernized, more industrialized cultures, European, Australian, North American cultures. So mainly usually of white skin is what I say within America. Collective cultures are Asian cultures, African cultures, Latino cultures, and so forth. So the idea of an individualistic culture is the ideology, and this is psychology terms, the ideology is the individualistic culture means that you put oneself above the best interest of the community. And the collective culture is the complete opposite, which means that you have to make sacrifices of yourself for the betterment of the family and the betterment of the community. So a lot of the times we talk about how sacrifice is a collective culture's love language. And in order to identify if you are respecting that culture, how are you identifying with that culture? Do you relate to a collective culture? And do you make sacrifices for that culture? Coming from an individualistic standpoint, they're not taught. We're not taught, especially within America, because America is very different in the fact that we have multiple collective cultures within the individualistic society. Individualistic society is also what keeps capitalism going as well. Speaking of capitalism, we do know that the foster care system is a $33 billion a year company. And we do refer to it as a company because there is money involved. There is money that is exchanged. There is a myth about abolishment that if we abolish the child welfare system, then so many children are going to die. We do have studies, and more recent studies, a lot of studies that were done were very much hypothesized and had smaller groups of people that were actually tested. Also, there's a different kind of population that's doing research. So you have younger people, more people of color that are actually involved in the research as well. So we actually know that children in foster care, and this is from the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia Policy Lab, and this came out in April of 2020. So this is all readily available. But children in foster care are actually 42% more likely to die in care than children in the general population. So essentially what they did was a study from 2003 till 2016, and they saw that the deaths within foster care remained the same. And they were very steady. Now, the general population between the years of 2003 and 2016, there was a decrease in deaths, and there has been a decrease in child fatalities in general population by 2.5% each year. So there's a lot of myths that if we don't have this system in place, then children are going to die. They're doing also a lot of new research and studies from the COVID-19 population, as we know that there was a lot less children within the child welfare system because they were not as involved with mandated reporters. So mandated reporters make up the most of the reasons why children are actually captured within the child welfare system. And we know that children of color, specifically Black children, are 5 times more likely to be captured than their counterparts within the family regulation system because of their proximity to mandated reporters. Now, there's also another conversation that we are having. What does it mean to be a mandated supporter versus a mandated reporter? So we're moving away from reporting and we're moving more towards supporting, which again goes more towards that individualistic mentality to more of this collective. So the mandated supporting, and I always love to use this example of, I remember there was a schools in Chicago, and there was a very high rate of children being absent from school. So as we know that when kids are absent from school, they can also trigger to call into the hotline of saying, hey, these kids aren't in school, maybe you need to go do a child welfare check. Well, come to find out, one of the reasons why specifically this school, that children were not going to school was because they didn't have clean uniforms. They didn't have access to a washer and dryer and have the finances to do that. And knowing, especially coming from communities of color, sending your child to school in dirty clothes means that you'll get a child welfare check, and that would be considered neglect. So how they solve that problem, instead of, again, the mandated reporting piece is supporting, and Tide laundry detergent essentially brought in multiple washers and dryers to the school. They brought them in on a trailer, and then the families were able to do their laundry for free, right? So essentially you're thinking about what is the issue and what is the problem and how can we solve it as a community, because we know that there's more negatively impact when children are actually involved in the child welfare system. So looking at the idea, and essentially what I would like for you to do if you are within the system is evaluate, how do you identify? Do you identify with individualistic cultures? Are you more of that Western culture? Are you more of the ideology of the individual, the independent, and so forth? Or do you come from collective cultures, which internally collective cultures is, again, that sacrifice of self for the betterment of the community, which is why most people don't understand or have the conversations. We do whenever we think about indigenous populations, and children that were sent to boarding schools, Native Americans. Also, I am Indigenous Native American here, Muskogee Creek Nation and Cherokee, and I'm also a survivor of the child welfare system as well. So I do come from that different perspective of speaking with lived experience, which is also greatly important in doing this work. But essentially, there's lots of conversations and research to show that when a child is removed from a community, removed from a family, then that continues that generational trauma, which a lot of generational trauma did have a foundation from the boarding schools. Another reason why in Canada, they were able to sue, I believe for 33, it was a very large amount of money, $1 billion for the children that were put in boarding schools because of that generational trauma that has been inflicted on that community. The same thing happens when there is a termination of rights within Black and Brown families. As a collective culture, it does not just affect that immediate family, but it ripples effects throughout the entire community. So having an understanding, a colonizing mentality within doing this work, and again, we're just raising this conversation. I will let people know how we continue these conversations and how I have the nationwide organization that I do, where we are survivors of the child welfare system, professionals and community members that just want to do anti-racism work. We continue these conversations. So this, we're just touching the surface of it. So don't feel as though that you're missing anything, because I am trying to just paint a large picture of what we're moving in and the direction of the for us, by us model, which is the people that are more impacted by the system should be the one to create the system that's best for us. The colonizing mentality, which a lot of it is an individualistic mentality, makes you believe that you have all the answers. And yet research shows that there's more negative impacts to the children and to the families that are involved. We know that as of 2019, the average amount of children that is within the foster care system, around 430,000 per year. 32 of that population do end up going with kin, but 46%, almost half of those children end up being adopted out. They end up being with non-family, non-relatives. So that is a very small amount that ends up actually returning home. There's other statistics that we are able to know, and this is why I want us to go back to that colonizing mentality, that we know that it's not working, and yet we keep doing the same thing. People within the abolishment field, a lot of us are lived experience and survivors of the system. And rarely do we have the conversations within my community of reimagining it, or how can we restructure it. The bones have always been negative. The foundation has been rooted in white supremacy. Most people have the idea that foster care began with the orphan trains, or group homes began with the orphan trains, but that's actually false. The first group homes actually were developed right after slavery ended, whenever previous or prior white, specifically white women slave owners or white women property owners, opened up what they considered group homes, and they were not referred to as group homes as then, but they essentially said, hey, all of you freed Black people are not able to financially take care of your kid. Let us house them. And that was where a lot of the sexual abuse and the mental abuse and still the physical abuse and the physical labor occurred. So it did not start with the orphan trains. It actually started at the end of slavery, whenever a lot of families did not have anywhere to go. And that's just a lot of history that I did not know until I start working and looking within outside of the system. And I realized, again, myself as an Indigenous Black woman, have a very colonizing mentality. And what that looks like is that you believe that you know what's best about a culture that you may not even relate to, due to what education that you have received about that population, not necessarily what that population reported is what's best for them. So when evaluating what your relationship is, and I know I have about 4 minutes because I really do want to give you time for feedback, because some of this is new information for people. Some of this, it may not be new, but either way it goes, I just want to give you some time to just digest all of this. But I want you to think about, what trauma do you bring into with the work that you do, and understanding just by being a social worker, you have a trauma footprint. The way that we evaluate carbon, specifically in Colorado, we like to be very, very environmentally cautious and understand what do we put out in the universe as just as a person within this field. And I say specifically social workers because I am a social worker. Not all caseworkers are social workers, and vice versa. But just by your presence and being in someone's family and someone's life, you are a system, and you are system involvement. And we bring trauma just by being a part of the system. We should not normalize families being involved in the system, and we normalize it. And then we create more systems from the systems after we've destroyed families and populations and discombobulated and destroyed communities. Then we create another system to do that. So I want you to evaluate what system, what trauma footprint do you bring with yourself? You will evaluate that by saying, do I relate to this community that I'm working within, or am I policing it? The field of social work is a policing field without a gun. And I say that as a very proud social worker, but also as very self-aware with the damage that I have done and the damage that I continue to do by working within the system that I know is rooted within bias and systemic racism. So understanding what your trauma footprint is, understanding your colonizing mentality to know that we have more negative outcomes and negative impacts and more children die in care, and yet we are still spending more than $33 billion a year on this. Another understanding that we should know as well is that the government spends on average 10 times more on foster care and adoption than they do with actually reunifying families. And this is all statistics that we have and that we know, and yet we continue to work within the system and we continue to uphold it. When I went to the American Psychological Association, the APA conference in Chicago in 2018, I remember I met this amazing doctor that studies Black boy trauma and trauma within Black men and Black boys. And he asked me after his presentation, it was phenomenal. And I went up to him and we started to chat. And he said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, I work in the child welfare system and I help assist and children be safe and hopefully reunify with their families." And he said, "Okay, so essentially you uphold white supremacy." And I said, "Well, I can't uphold white supremacy because I'm a person of color." And he said, "Unless you are dismantling it, unless you are actively pulling down the system, then you are actively holding it up. And if you're not actively holding it up, then it sits on your shoulders. So you're still doing injustices. You're still doing damage, even by just being present." So if you have been in this field one day, 30 years, 50 years, the question that I always have my students ask when they enter the field as new social workers is, what have the people done and your mentors done to dismantle white supremacy structures within this field? And if you cannot answer that question, if you cannot talk about policies that you've worked with or things that you've dismantled to make it equal or biases and so forth, then you're not deserving, nor are you qualified to work with collective cultures because they are more negatively impacted than individualistic cultures. So I am very grateful to have this conversation with you. I'm very grateful to open this up also to comments and questions. It is a lot of information, but I'm also a resource. So I will let Stacey filter some questions in.
Thank you, MJ. There are several questions and many comments. So let's see. Let me just let's start with this first one. Can we get a link to the foster care versus general population research you talked about? And if you don't have it available, we can send it out to folks as well.
Absolutely. I can absolutely do that. It is, honestly, if you sent, it's from the Hospital of Philadelphia Policy Lab, April 2022. So if you just Google that, if you Google children in foster care, 42% more likely to die, the article pops right up. Okay,
thanks. And if we can find it, we'll put it in the chat. Otherwise, we can send it out to the audience as well. So we have a lot of comments. I'm just trying to get through. People want to know how you've become an awesome radical human. Oh. And let's see. So Rachel here said, what are some realistic ways we can break down racial barriers and stop holding up the white systemic racism?
Yes. So here's the thing. This is something that colonizers, and mind you, and I say colonizer because I am so completely done with white savior. White savior has been like taught up to kind of be cute and nice. And I also am not a white savior, but I do have a colonizing mentality, right? And this is the way colonizers think, is they think that I am the one with the solution. I have the degree, therefore I have the solution. But what I want people to think about in question is, are you qualified? And who said you were qualified? Because a degree does not qualify you as a social worker. And mind you, if you're not doing social justice, if you're not doing policy reform and creating equality, you are not a social worker. Because before people were able to even go to school, before it was legal for people of color to even go to school, we've been social working. It's been our entire basis of fighting for equality is social work. So I always want people to look around and say, ooh, am I qualified? Am I qualified to work with this population? Am I able to respect this population the way that they should be respected? And if you're not, then I ask you to remove yourself and to put someone else in place that can. Because when you have more people that's respecting collective cultures, then the system falls automatically because that white supremacy won't be there. And I know it sounds like it's not possible to happen. But again, when capitalism is involved, we have to hit it with capitalism. There was something that a parent advocate told me, and mind you, also research shows that parents that are involved in the system, where all of parents that are currently involved in the system fighting to get their kids back with the DNA case, over 40% were in the system as a child. So we know that we're creating generational trauma. And one of my parent advocates that I mentor, who is phenomenal, and I also sent, I interviewed him. I have a YouTube channel called Abolish, of course, and that is on my website as well. But his story is phenomenal because he was removed when he was like in elementary school. He's been in multiple foster homes, multiple group homes, aged out of the system from juvenile, was falsely accused. There was abuse happening in his foster home. The foster parents blamed him. He was falsely accused, grew up in juvenile, then came out, went to prison, became a parent. His children then got into the system, and then he fought and won his TPR. But what he told me hit me so hard, and I hope you feel this when I say this, because I never felt this. And he said, "You all are human traffickers. You get paid. You get money to move children around, and children have no say. I begged to go back home to my mom. I begged to be back with my family. And I got moved to different places and money was exchanged. How are you not a human trafficker?" And for me to have done this work for as long as I've done this, thinking that I was doing the right thing, but also seeing the other end, seeing my juveniles becoming older and then having children and then treating them terribly after we, as a government system, raised them, who our rights should have been terminated as a government system, raised them. I said, oh my gosh, we are human traffickers. We move children around and there's money involved and they don't want it. They don't want it. We know of all of child welfare cases, we know that less than 18%, less than 20%, around 18% are actual abuse cases. And what is that, 82%? 82 are actual neglect, but those neglect cases is actually poverty. Can you imagine what we can do with $33 billion attacking that poverty piece? So evaluate yourself and see, do you belong here? Because people that are caseworkers, they have the hardest job, in my opinion. I've never been a caseworker, but my colleagues that are caseworkers, my colleagues that I've worked with for many years that I have the utmost respect for, have been put in very uncomfortable situations to where they didn't believe in the system anymore, but they also knew that that was their job, right? So evaluate if you still want to be on that side when you have an entire generation of people that are survivors of the system saying you did it wrong and you knew you did it wrong and you continue to do it wrong.
Okay, MJ, we've got time for a few more questions. So this one says, I have had women I work with say they wish they own culture offered the I have had women I work with say they wish they own culture offered the programs we white people offer. I am just not sure how to help another culture raise up the same programs. Suggestions?
Yeah, I don't believe that here's the thing. If we had equality, we wouldn't need programs. When I was a student in social work, I never wanted to work within policies. I thought it was dirty, it was messy, it was complicated. You won't need programs, you wouldn't need systems if you were abolishing the policies that upheld white supremacy. We as professionals in the system, we are so, as I say, a factory social workers. We are inundated with systems, that's what we spit out. That's what we talk about, that's what we spit out. What if we left people alone? And what if we treated people equally? Like, can we reimagine just what equality can actually be and look like in the States where people would not need a system? They wouldn't even need involvement. We should be working ourselves out of a job. And yet, every year there's more money into this system. We need to not think within systems. We need to think within cultures. We don't need to think within programs at all. We need to let people be. If you did not do your job and someone else from that community that was related to that culture, related to that family, actually had a stake, actually made sacrifices, right? Because that's what we're taught to do from collective cultures. Do you think that you would even be needed? The idea of colonizing is saying, I need to be here because I told myself I needed to be here because my organization, which is a colonizing organization, said that I needed to be here. So therefore, I'm here to do what's best for you.
Thank you. I'm having a hard time getting through the questions because there's lots of comments that folks seem to be really moved and inspired by your presentation. And so I think a lot of folks are kind of taking in the information. The last two questions are sort of similar, so I'll try to combine them, and you can take, a few minutes over if you need to, MJ. These people are asking kind of what can the average social worker do, him or herself or their self, to be more impactful in affecting the broken system. And then furthermore, in terms of if we abolish the system, how then do folks come alongside families to ensure that families are whole and children are safe? So those are some big questions.
Really, I want to tackle the first one, and then I may have you repeat the second one for me. The idea that the system is broken is a myth. The system is never broken. None of them have ever been broken. They are working exactly. If the system was broken, then the system would not make money. The system makes money, so therefore it is not broken. What people have to do is, and this is what I say to my students, unless you are an ally or a co-conspirator of that population of people, you should not be working with them because you are policing them. We in America have the lowest morality within white American culture of what an ally is. An ally does not mean that you do not use derogatory language to describe a group of people. An ally means that you've done an action to fight for them. And I don't mean by getting paid. I don't mean by doing your job. I don't mean by policing a group of people. What I mean by allyship and a co-conspirator is that you look to the community and you say, what can I do? You don't look within your system because you all are like-minded within systems. The reason why I do what I do is I keep a pulse within the system. So I still work within the system as an expert. I still supervise parents. So I still am close to that pain and that empathy that they are experiencing, and having people experiencing termination of rights, experiencing generational trauma, experiencing racism, biases, classism, and so forth. I still keep my pulse on that. But I work on the outside of the system. You won't be able to change your mentality if you are only within the system. One way of how you can work with on the outside of the system is to join the coalition. So the MJCF coalition is my nonprofit that we just launched in April. So our website is up and running. We're still adding things to it. But essentially what we do is we work with everyone on the outside of the system, and we say, what do you need and how do we do? We offer services like grief trauma therapy for parents that have had their rights terminated. We call it phantom grief therapy. Can you imagine that we've been terminating rights, and I don't know of any within the state of Colorado organization that have ever done services of grief therapy for parents that have had their rights terminated. So we know when their rights terminated, it's untreated trauma. And again, they continue to be in the system, right? We also do therapy of how to help families heal collectively after the department has reunited your family. There's so much trauma that we don't even think about, so much trauma of removing a child, removing families, dispersing them, having them be in strangers' homes. And then parents have came to me and said, our children don't even trust us. They don't even trust that when someone knocks on the door, no one's going to take them. I have not heard of any program saying, how do we reunify? How do we reunify the love, the support, and the safety and trust within the family after the department has left? We also do therapy of group support therapy for parents that have had that have had domestic violence on their treatment plan, because, and I say in the state of Colorado, but I also know it's nationally, parents that have been survivors of domestic violence are re-victimized through the system and also penalized that they were not keeping their children safe. So we do support groups for that. So my recommendation is to work outside the system, be within community, and then you'll learn how to support the community. But you're not going to figure it out doing, this staff meeting with everyone else that are professionals within the system, because we are all colonizers and we're all policing communities of color. That is what we do as a job.
Okay, MJ, there are several more questions, but we do have to wrap up. So I'm going to put those questions in the parking lot Google Doc, and I'll send that to you to send out to folks. And the link to the study, if you could just send it to me and I can get it out to the chat when we're done.
Sure, I can do that. Thank you so much for this. Again, join the coalition. We meet once a month nationally. Everyone logs on from all over. They're professionals of the system. Everyone wants to do something bigger and something better. Everyone that's on the ground, right, that I know. Not necessarily the management, not necessarily the decision makers, but there's going to be more of us that are from lived experiences and are co-conspirators and allies of the population that's more negatively impacted. Then there will be people that are making the decisions, and then we will make a large impact. So I am so grateful for this opportunity. Thank you so much for being so gracious to me and giving me this time. And I wish you all a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, MJ, and thank you for the audience members who participated in the Q&A. Appreciate it.